Fire Emblem, engage!
Hello everyone, Big Clingy here for my thoughts on the 17th entry in the Fire Emblem series. Or is it 19th according to the game's code? I want to start this off with a slight confession of bias. Engage is very much the anti-Three Houses, which is exactly what I was hoping for from the next Fire Emblem game. However, I am going to avoid mentioning Three Houses anywhere else in this video. I'd like to talk about Engage on its own merits, rather than comparing it to a different game. And I'll start with the story and characters because they're by far the most contentious aspects. I wanted the next Fire Emblem to have a more light-hearted, heroic fantasy good versus evil story. But even I will admit that I didn't expect it to be this light. The tone I was hoping for was more along the lines of Path of Radiance or Blazing Sword. Idealistic, but also ultimately grounded. Engage? Okay, I'm not going to use the cliched anime comparison, because to me it's actually not accurate. I think this game's tone is more comparable to a late 2000s Western cartoon. And you can really see this in the opening movie, which I unironically loved, and it hooked me on the game the instant I first saw it. As a disclaimer though, I was actually a brony for a few years, so this style appeals to me more than it does a lot of other people. But the thing that I like about the tone of this game is that it's not ashamed of what it is. And never do the writers really feel like they're embarrassed by what they're doing, they just embrace it. Just because a story is light and cartoonish doesn't make it bad, just different. And just like those works of the late 2000s, just because the story is cartoonish doesn't mean it's not afraid to get dark at times. There is a moment later on where you deal with a village that was massacred, leaving no survivors, and this is not glossed over. Later on, the story even deals with some pretty deep themes such as cycles of abuse, gaslighting, and found family. They're not always handled perfectly, but I appreciate the attempt. And these themes make Sombron come across less generically than he otherwise would, despite him still being pretty clear-cut evil. A character can be unsympathetic and still interesting if the way they're unsympathetic is unique by the standards of the series. However, I am not saying this story is perfect. Very far from it. There are some major issues I had with it that I will cover now. The first is, there's a lot of tell don't show in this story. It starts quite early when a major character dies, and then after a jump cut, Aaliyah is thanking people for helping with their funeral. When I saw this I was like, wait, there was a funeral? These jumps fade after a while, but they're replaced with some long-winded exposition dumps of the villains' backstories in the later half of the game. Speaking of, I do think the back end is the weakest part of the story. I'm not going to go into direct spoilers here, but I will say my least favourite moment is the ending of chapter 23, where the heroes would be entirely screwed out of continuing the plot if it weren't for one of the villains doing something, then almost literally saying, "This makes no sense and I have no idea why I did it." And I've left this gripe until last because it's both a gameplay and a story one. That is that, from chapter 14 onwards, you fight the same bosses almost constantly. This was probably intended to make you care about the villains more, but ironically it actually made them less memorable to me. Not only was I frustrated at fighting the same bosses over and over, but Fire Emblem VII's Four Fangs, for example, were memorable because they got a lot of story build up, and then one big memorable boss fight chapter. Sometimes less is more. That said, these bosses do vary up their tactics a bit, and some of them use quite interesting map gimmicks, but it still got to the point where I was begging for generic enemy commanders, which actually did happen once. Actually, on that note, there is another major story gripe I have to bring up here, and that is that there is one villain who I feel was so ridiculously wasted, I have no idea what the writers were thinking. So this is a very major character with a lot of emotional drama with some of your recruited allies. He easily could have been the boss of his own chapter, or even his own arc. Instead, he is thrown into a map that already had 5 other bosses. Really. And that's the only time you fight him. Making his emotional boss conversations unintentionally funny because they're just so lost in the crowd. Overall, the story is not my favourite Fire Emblem story by a long shot, but it's also far from my least favourite. But it would probably be a lot lower if it weren't for the characters. Or, more accurately, if it weren't for Alear. Alear was the surprise standout of this story to me. They have no right to be this good. After all the controversy over their appearance in the pre-release, which I never minded, I was really surprised to find that Alear is a surprisingly endearing and well-written character. They are easily my favourite avatar now, though they're not much of one since they've got their own established personality. The thing that I love most about Alear is they're allowed to genuinely have emotions. Throughout the whole story, and in fully voice-acted support, they get to be happy, sad, vengeful, betrayed, despairing, and mildly creeped out by Clan and Fram's fan club. Their characterization and voice performance, both of them, elevated a lot of scenes that would have otherwise felt generic to me. For example, a certain death early on that's not much of a spoiler, I actually cared a billion times for it more than, let's just say, a certain similar death in a certain other game, just because Alear was able to actually emote to it. Besides Alear, the only other characters to get major story focus are the primary, let's just say, royals of the 4 nations. Each nation has a secondary royal who has less presence because they're allowed to die. And I like all of them. My personal favourites are Ivy, who transcended so much beyond being a Camilla clone, and Temera, who's just such a fun ray of sunshine while also being surprisingly pragmatic in supports. And that lets me segue to something else. Supports in this game are the main way to know the characters who don't get a lot of story presence. And for the most part, the supports are pretty good and gave me a lot of appreciation for this cast. But they have a few problems that hold back a lot of players from getting to like this cast. The main one is, supports are pretty hard to raise and engage. I'd recommend looking at Serene's Forest pages for more detailed information, but in brief, you only gain support on the player phase, you have to be adjacent, and instead of getting to keep all the support points you earned in a battle, the top 3 support pairs get their gains rounded to specific, quite low numbers. The best way to gain supports is the Somniel activities that were added in a free patch. By the end of the first playthrough, I was struggling to get A's on most of my characters, and I had to spam gifts with Alear to even have access to S supports I wanted. Additionally, unlike other modern Fire Emblems, you really don't have enough time or room to use everyone, so it will take multiple playthroughs to unlock a character's support with all their partners. This means that while many of the cast are very good and have good supports, they're also easy to miss. And this leads to another problem that I have with this game's support system and its characters. The Firene cast are easily the weakest and the most tropey of the bunch, and you get them first, so the early supports leave a very bad first impression. Support quality, I find, jumps up immensely once the Brodia cast joins. And Saline is a perfect example. Her support with Furine characters?
Very much so. I particularly enjoy the aroma. I smell a hint of citrus, along with floral notes, yes? More than one variety, if I'm not mistaken.
Loving tea is my one defining trait. Her supports with Alchrist?
I dreamt my brother died.
Oh.
This is a recurring dream, mind you. One that I have had many times since childhood. My brother used to be chronically ill, you see. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he might be taken from me at any moment.
One final thing about characters I feel the need to address. One of the biggest concerns of people going into Engage is that the emblems, heroes from past games, will overshadow the new cast. This is, in my opinion, not true. Of all the emblems, only Marth, and to a far lesser extent Sigurd, have anything vaguely resembling story relevance. And they're more like mouthpieces for the concept of emblems within the world of Helios than actual characters with personalities. So don't worry about them overshadowing the Engage cast. In my opinion, they really don't. I think of them like rare blades from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Equipment for characters that just happens to talk. And that right there is a good segue into the gameplay, which is the real draw of Engage. This is the most fun I've had playing a Fire Emblem game in a long time. Now, I cannot go over all the gameplay in this one video. I plan on doing a full Let's Play of this game on my channel eventually, and I have plenty to say there, so this is just gonna be the Cliff Notes version. And if I miss anything, I'll probably answer it in the comments. Before even discussing the emblems, I need to talk about the map design. By far, the best in the series since Fate's Conquest. Each of these maps felt like a unique strategic challenge, requiring you to really think about your moves and how you used your party members. I found that in some recent games, everyone eventually devolved into a blob of stats that you just throw at the enemy and watch them die. That is not true here. Every class is a specific tool for a specific situation, and if you don't use the right tool for the right situation, you will get punished. Because of this, this game has my favourite version of the time rewind mechanic, even though it's literally identical to Echoes and Three Houses. This is because every time I lost a unit and had to rewind, it was clear to me that I made a mistake, and there was a specific thing I could do to fix that mistake. Some fans complain that rewinds encourage you to make reckless moves without thinking, but to me, it was an encouragement to learn from my mistakes and be better.
Whatever you say.
And the limited uses on hard and maddening felt like an extra live system from a different video game. I don't think it's good design anymore to be forced to redo an entire chapter because you made one mistake. Though admittedly having unlimited rewinds on normal is a bit overkill, if you are playing normal, I'd encourage you to be sparing with that. Speaking of which, the overall difficulty curve of this game is quite nice. While it is one of the harder modern Fire Emblem games, that's not by much in my opinion, and it is absolutely not as stress-inducing as Conquest, even on maddening. I did my first playthrough on hard, and I actually had to restart Chapter 2 twice, which I honestly enjoyed. And it could get tricky at times around the middle, but I did find that for someone with my experience in the series, the last few chapters on hard got very, very easy. As of recording this, I played up to Chapter 20 on maddening mode, and I was surprised at how gradual the difficulty curve was in the main chapters. Every time I beat a main chapter, my party was decently equipped to take on the next one immediately. Though I will say, this game is made a lot easier if you pick a team of 12 and commit to them from the start. I'll go into that more when I talk about character balance. But while the main story has been enjoyable on maddening so far, I have noticed that the paralogs on Maddening, the Emblem one specifically, are a significant spike up from their hard mode versions, and I've had to put off many of the Maddening paralogs for much later than I did on my hard file. I don't know if this is poor difficulty scaling or an intentional design choice to make it harder for you to unlock the potential of emblems. Either way, I am terrified of Erika's paralog because that map kicked my butt even on hard. And speaking about difficult chapters and the core map design, one thing I've seen get near unanimous praise from players is, without spoiling much, this game does something really cool at a certain point in the story, and it makes you reevaluate a lot of your gameplay priorities in an awesome way. Now on to class and character balancing, and here my opinions are very weird because there's some very clear balance issues here, but at the same time, I never felt they hurt the experience as much as they probably should have. So firstly, a very common complaint I see online is that a lot of the early joining characters are not that great in the long haul, and some of the later joining pre-promotes are incredibly strong. This leads a lot of people to believe that the early characters are only good for a couple of chapters and then should get dropped in favour of the later ones. And while this is kind of true, there's a few things that prevent it being a deal breaker for me. Firstly, a lot of these early characters have legitimately great utility in the early chapters. Without Clan, you are doomed against early Armor Knights. Without Etier, you are doomed against early Flyers. And for those like Lapis who are outclassed by later people in similar classes, well, nothing's stopping you from using two of the same class. In fact, it's outright encouraged with backup classes. In fact, chain attack utility is so good that I brought untrained Anna all the way to chapter 10 on Maddening for chain attacks alone. The thing that makes me not mind these early game quote-unquote bad units is they're only bad in a relative sense. Everybody in Engage is average at worst, and anybody is viable with investment, and while many longtime fans groan at units requiring investment, I found that the amount of investment needed to make someone good in Engage is very minimal. As I said, the early characters like Clan will be getting a lot of kills just from their utility alone, so they don't require a ton of experience to catch up. All you really need is just a Master Seal or a Second Seal. If you keep using somebody throughout the game, if you keep them in your core party of 12, they're gonna be good by endgame. I've seen people make Etier work without that much effort. And if you do decide to drop them for someone else later on, that's fine too. A thing I love about Engage is that, with the arguable exceptions of Anna and Jean, where that's kind of their gimmick, every new recruit joins at the appropriate level for their join chapter, ready to slot into your team instantly if you want them. And this somehow made the experience I put into the dropped unit not feel wasted, because they still helped me through those early chapters, and I still appreciated that. What I find interesting is that many units in my first playthrough had fluctuating performance throughout the game. Anna and Lapis were both pretty bad early on, but once they promoted, they started snowballing hard and became some of my best combat units in the endgame. Diamant was the reverse. When I first got him, he one-rounded everything and never died, but past the halfway point, his bad dex growth really came into play, and he ended up still pretty solid, but not perfect by the endgame. Similarly, Louis was fantastic early on and for the mid-game, but dropped off somewhat at the end. But this was fun, as it meant that my units gained personalities of their own through gameplay, which is something that I have missed in Fire Emblem. For example, Lapis is one of my favourite characters now, and that's because she got good the moment that I was considering dropping her. She proved herself to me through the fourth wall, and it worked. But speaking of my Lapis bias, there is one character that I do think is just disgustingly broken, and I don't know what the developers were thinking, and that's Kagetsu. He has some of the best bases and growths in the game. It's just stupid, and I don't like using him for that reason. Like the characters, the class system also has its issues, but I still enjoyed it. It is actually my favourite reclassing system in the franchise, as it has just enough customization while also not feeling overwhelming. Every class has fixed weapon ranks similar to Fire Emblem IV. This prevents tedious weapon rank grinding and lets people contribute in their new roles the moment they're reclassed, especially for staves. To become a class, either by reclassing or promotion, you need to have its weapon proficiencies, for example, tomes and staves for Sage. Characters have innate proficiencies, usually enough for one specific promotion that suits their stat build, but they can gain more by leveling up their bond with emblems. There's room to go with either the default promotions or branch out, and either way feels viable. There are a few characters who have growth builds that strongly encourage reclassing, Anna, but they're still perfectly usable in their default promotions. I felt like even on Maddening, I didn't need to fully grasp the quote-unquote class meta to do well. But at the same time, you might find something that works unexpectedly well if you experiment. Another cool thing I found about this system is different emblems, and different proficiencies therefore, are available at different points in the story, which gives some characters interesting strengths and weaknesses based on the emblems that are around when they join. For example, Lapis has easier access to an early hero reclass than Kagetsu does. Though DLC does mess with this a lot. I would encourage you to do a full run without using the DLC bracelets if you haven't already. It does change a lot of the dynamics. When I mentioned early hero reclass, I should say there's no reason not to promote early in this game. Your experience gain is entirely based on your total gained levels, so you're not treated as a level 20 unit if you promote at level 10. Promoted classes typically have higher class growth, so you'll have slightly better stats in the end if you go into them early, and anybody can loop back to level 1 once they reach level 20 in their promoted class with a second seal. The way skills are handled is another reason this is my favourite reclassing system. Every promoted class has one skill. It's learned at level 5, and you only have access to it as long as you're in that class. This means no more reclassing to something you don't intend on using just for a skill you want. If you are putting a character in a specific class, it is only because you want to use that character in that class, and I love this. On the subject of class balance, I feel obliged to mention that Klingies are actually good in this game. Mostly due to their break community, meaning they're one of the very few classes that can actually get things done on the enemy phase. But also, their defense is so insane, they're virtually immune to physical enemies. Mages will melt them though, so keep them far away from those. This logic applies to enemy Armor Knights too. They are virtually indestructible to non-armor slaying physical weapons, but your tome users will make short work of them. There are some classes that are admittedly a bit underpowered compared to others, like Berserker and Swordmaster, but all in all, I still found the reclass system enjoyable. There's usually at least one class that works very well on each character, and in general, there's a lot less juggling of customization options and resources to make somebody viable. But I will admit this is fully a me thing. I get decision paralysis easily, and to this day, I still can't comprehend Fates' class meta, so a system like this works well for someone like me. Speaking of which, interviews confirm that the core gameplay mechanic, Emblems, was added to make customization feel more streamlined. Instead of sinking tons of resources and effort into customizing someone, you just slap an emblem on them and bang, they've got a new role. I can't go into the ins and outs of every individual emblem here, but I will say I love how they made all of them feel unique but also usable. Even the weaker ones in combat like Leaf come with incredible utility. But the main thing I love about Emblems is it feels like every time I go to a YouTube comment section or a forum discussion of Engage, I find a new way to use emblems that I never even thought of before. Sigurd on a Dancer, Ike on Panette for Wrath, Erica on a Fist user to punch through armor, Lyn on an armored unit to create doubles that physical attackers can't break through. These might seem obvious now, but they felt mind-blowing in the first weeks of this game. Every emblem seems to have one blatantly obvious use, and then a whole bunch of less obvious uses just waiting to be discovered. And it's so fun finding different emblem combinations that unexpectedly work. Emblems also allow your characters to inherit skills, and this is a weird mechanic for me because I didn't find myself using it very much. I just put Headlong Rush on a couple of people, some later people could afford Alacrity off of their base SP amounts, and that was about it. SP felt very, very difficult to get without extensive grinding in skirmishes, or, of course, DLC. A later patch did let you get SP books without DLC, but I didn't have access to that for my entire first run, so I felt very SP starved, and had to be very selective with what skills I inherited from emblems. But I enjoyed playing this way, as it made every inheritance feel like a meaningful choice, rather than slapping cancer on everyone because I could afford it. But at the same time, it means I don't have much experience with what the game is like if you do grind for SP, so anyone who has done that, please tell me in the comments. And finally in core gameplay, there is the Somniel. And apologies, but I'm going to bring up Three Houses one more time here. I hated the monastery in Three Houses, and it played a big role in my disillusionment with that game as the years went on. At first, I felt the Somniel was the monastery done right. It was far less intrusive, only requiring a couple of minutes between each chapter. It was also a nice way to unwind after the chapters were over. Around a third of the way through my first playthrough though, I started to dislike the Somniel a bit. It felt more intrusive than the monastery because it was clearly detached from what was going on in the story. For example, the story intro of chapter 14 makes no sense if you spent time in the Somniel beforehand. The minigames were also a huge point of contention. Besides Wyvern Ride, which is kinda fun, and Strength Training, which I have to do for better stats on Aaliyah before each fight. Oh, and Caring for Sommi because you're a monster if you don't. I found myself playing every minigame once and then never going back to it again. Fishing especially. I've just seen so many fishing minigames in JRPGs lately, and this one feels like the least thought out of all of them. You don't even need the bond fragments for it, since I discovered that you can claim achievements for bonding fragments at the bulletin board. Seriously, do this. It makes a huge difference, and it's my biggest piece of advice to new players. But as I got into the later part of the story, the Somniel started bothering me less. I still rarely engage with the minigames besides the ones I described, but for some reason, I just got used to it. I don't think it's a truly amazing mechanic, but it's a nice compromise between having a fully explorable 3D base and not having it be 80% of the gameplay. Another mechanic that I feel wasn't thought through was the animal adoption. It's cute in theory, but in practice, most players fill their entire yard with dogs because that gets you medals for forging. Nothing else felt nearly as useful, and that's a shame because I'm a cat person. Another thing that elevates an otherwise average story is that Engage has my favourite presentation of any modern Fire Emblem except maybe Echo's. The voice acting is overall decent, and the music is fantastic, as is typical of the series. But my favourite aspect has got to be how much personality the 3D animations have. This is the first 3D Fire Emblem to have critical animations approaching the flashy glory of the Game Boy Advance ones. And even the non-crit combat animations flow so amazingly well. the battles feel much more action-packed and dynamic now. And I don't even mind the lack of 2D menu art, as the 3D menu models for each character are so characterful and expressive. Overall, I'm still very much in the honeymoon period for Engage, so I can't tell you where it will end up on my list of Fire Emblems in the end. But for now, this is the most fun I've had with the gameplay of a Fire Emblem entry in a long, long time. This is also the Fire Emblem gameplay I always wanted. As much tactical depth as Conquest, but not quite as brutally hard. And as long as you're a fan of the cartoonish tone, the story and characters aren't as bad as you might think. They're still not my favourites in the series, but they're far from the bottom of the pack either. Overall, Engage may be one of my new favourite Switch games, and I look forward to replaying it in the years to come. I also look forward to covering it on the channel someday. Thank you all for listening to my opinions on another game, and I'll see you all next time.